want to remind everyone, we just had a presidential election last November, not that long ago, in which the major candidates for president, Trump, Biden, and then Harris, none of them ever mentioned the declining empire of the United States. And none of them mentioned, to my knowledge, the BRICS or any basic shift. There was nothing to discuss about a changed world economy. That I find devastatingly powerful evidence that we have a very basic disconnect. And I think Mr. Trump is in the process of now discovering step by step that what he didn't calculate, all of what he will no doubt call unintended consequences, or what he'll blame on others, is that you can't declare a tariff against the rest of the world. Can't do that. That is too crazy. That is too overwhelming. That is got too many variables going in too many directions to get you any confidence in whatever prediction you make.
I think some of the strategic vacuum that exists both in the United States and Europe comes from the inability to, as you said, recognize the time we live in. So your example with the American presidential election, that there's an election, no one discusses the historical time we're living in, actually the decline of US empire, and now countries in the East and leading with China now taking over, being the key drivers of the global economy, that this has to be the central focus, because when you develop a strategy, you see the main trends, you see your resources, and how you can maximize your benefits within this context. But it's a bit problem even after the Cold War. This was a problem because we kept speaking of the post-Cold War era, which is a very poor concept because you're just referring to what is no longer here. It used to be Cold War, now it's not. We should have called this the hegemonic era, but it's not good for marketing, I guess. But this is why I think the current era has to be defined as the end of unipolarity and transition to multipolarity. If you see it like this, the US could have some strategic clarity. Again, it would be good for America and good for the world. How US in relative decline, how does it readjust with the rest of the world? How can we live with the Chinese as a equal in a way that's mitigates the threats or challenges and maximize the benefits? But these are not the talks we're having. Instead, we're talking about communism and the freedom-loving peoples, and it's just like one long Coca-Cola commercial. It's very strange, and we're missing the same here in Europe. I don't want to. It's too popular in Europe to bash the Americans, but here I think it's even worse because we hedged our wagon to the United States. This was going to be collective empire, collective hegemony, and in the multipolar world, you see the US drifting in other directions, having different priorities. So what are the Europeans doing? Instead of diversifying their economic connectivity, ending this militarized division of Europe, what do? Well, we try to increase our own stock value in America by, being even more submissive, even more obedient, hoping that Americans will still value us as an ally and, bump up us in the rank of priorities. So, a former hegemon will still think we're a priority. I mean, the whole thing is quite insane. And as you said, the different Europeans have different interests. We know the EU is not pursuing the national interest of its members anymore. So it is, complete chaos. And in this chaos, I think they're trying to grab onto the Russian boogeyman as a way to pull together consensus. But again, this is a consensus which is further undermining our national interest. Again, remilitarizing the dividing lines of Europe and cutting our own economies down in size by cutting ourselves off their energy in the huge Russian market. So I don't know. I'm very frustrated by Europe, and it's little reason to optimism. But you did mention the Ukraine war seemingly coming to an end, and I see this on the battlefield. You see the economy not doing well. Also, the internal cohesion is not great. You hear more Ukrainian voices recognizing that it's coming to an end. Ukrainians also high-ranking Ukrainians are starting to recognize that perhaps the NATO countries weren't there to help, but to use the Ukrainians for, their manpower to fight Russia. So things are starting to crack. I'm not saying it will fall apart within the next few weeks or even the next 2-3 months, but we seem to be entering the end game here. So if we lose this war in NATO, and NATO loses this war, which was, many people hoped this would revive the hegemonic era. Now it fears that it would break the golden era. I think it was a Polish president who said it, that if we lose the war in Ukraine, it will end the golden era of the West. What do you think would happen? What will be the direct consequence? Not if, but when we lose the war in Ukraine?
I'm afraid that the way that is shaping up here in the United States is that Europe has very little to offer us, and therefore can be dispensed with. Mr. Trump says, I'm going to walk away. If I don't get what I want in Ukraine, well, then I will walk away. And it's a European problem. If I were the Europeans, I would be terrified of that, not for the reason they are, which I understand. The United States, if you couldn't defeat Russia with American weapons and with American money, you're sure as hell not going to do it without American weapons and American money. That's just silly. No one takes that seriously, except perhaps the media in Europe. It's hard to tell. But this notion of walking away is supported by a transformation which has gone on now for some time, led by the conservative Republican base, that the Europeans are cheating us, that the Europeans are exploitative. It's kind of a strange rendition of economics from a kind of moralizing perspective, which used to be dismissed here as old-fashioned and not hard-headed. But you actually see it here. I'll give you a couple of examples. Mr. Trump has economic advisors. I know some of them, like Scott Bessent or Mr. Navarro and some of the others. Okay, they apparently have told him something which, if they said it in a seminar among economists, they'd be laughed out of the room. But they have said it to him that if there's a trade imbalance, in other words, if I'll pick a country, Vietnam sends $100 billion worth of cheap clothing to the United States, but only buys 40 billion worth of whatever it gets from the United, that this is a sign of cheating. Now, not only is it a sign of cheating, but it's a sign of cheating by the government of Vietnam. So when I hear this and I explain to my audiences here in America that the decision to produce clothing in Vietnam was made in many cases by American corporations moving production from China, where the wages had risen, to Vietnam, where they hadn't yet, and that therefore this was a profit-driven and profit-generating decision made by American corporations whose headquarters are in Washington down the street, that you are blaming on the Vietnamese government. That makes no sense. That's ignorant, and you're not an ignorant person. What is this? Well, I think you have to go then to the ideology. It's just, well, they see the Europeans as more weight to carry, more uselessness. We're better than them. We are more technically advanced. We have a much better military. They don't even have a decent military. It's just, oh. And you'll see if Mr. Trump withdraws you'll see it very quickly, blame the loss of Ukraine on the Europeans. 100%, I guarantee it to you, because he will blame whatever happens on the designated losers. He can never criticize capital or capitalism or capitalists. That's why he cannot acknowledge that half of the stuff that comes into the U.S. from China is coming from subsidiaries of American business there. He has to say things they all do. They stole the technology. They didn't. The Chinese made a very calculated deal. You Americans or Japanese or German or Dutch, it doesn't matter. You can come to China. You can hire our disciplined labor force for a small fraction of what you pay at home, and we will give you access to the Chinese market, which is now the largest and fastest growing market in the world. Well, I've taught in business schools. That's what we teach entrepreneurs. Go where the wages are low and the market is growing, of course. And they went to China because that's where it's happening. To turn around and then when the Chinese say, okay, we're going to give you the labor force and we're going to give you a market access, you have to share your technology. That was a deal many American corporations were happy to agree to. Happy. They could continue to develop the technology. They wouldn't have to slow down. They'd have to give what's already known anyway to the Chinese in exchange for staggering improvements in profitability, which is why so many of them went. But notice the logic. This story, if you were to tell it to the American people, they kind of know it. They really do. But it's not a story that can be told. Here's the irony of it all. It is the struggle between capital and labor. It is the struggle, it is Marx's class struggle that in the end is shaping all of this. What happened in the United States in this last century begins and is always driven by the stunning reality of the 1930s. Europeans somehow, and when I meet with them, they either don't know the history or they don't give it the weight they ought to. In the 1930s, when capitalism globally collapses in 1929, and we have the horror of everything that unfolded in the 30s, the American working class lurched to the left. It joined in huge numbers trade unions. It was the greatest unionization in American history. Never had anything like it before, and have never had anything like it since. You ended up with a third of the labor force in unions, and they were powerful unions in all the basic industries. The CIO, it was called. And you had hundreds of thousands of people joining two large socialist parties and one large communist party. And they were powerful enough, all working together, the socialists, the communists, and the labor unions. Despite all their disagreements and troubles, they worked together. And they were incredible. They went to the president and they basically said, you have to do something in this Great Depression. You really have to do something, or else there's going to be a revolution here. And Roosevelt, the president, a centrist Democrat, rather like, Bill Clinton or someone like that, understood that he was talking to his voters. And the communists didn't hesitate. They said, you either give us something or we'll vote you right out of here. You'll be gone. Because you have to be better than the Republicans or else we have no reason. And we'll make our own party. So he gave them in very short time, the Social Security system, we had never had that in this country, a state pension, a minimum wage that was decent. We never had that before. An unemployment program. If you lose your job, you immediately get money for a year or two. And finally, public employment, 15 million jobs. I mean, and all of this cost a fortune, and the government had no money because it was a depression, and businesses weren't paying taxes, consumers weren't paying taxes, and workers were out of work and paying no taxes. So he had to go to the rich, which he did. He went big taxes and big borrowing. And he borrowed to take care of the mass of people, to give them a check for nothing because they were old or they were unemployed. It's capitalism's anathema. It is. And when the war is over and the president who did this is dead and the Nazis are defeated, there has been one objective hammered home in the ruling class of this country. Undo the New Deal. Cancel all of it. Not just get rid of the public employment, which they did. But drop the minimum wage so it becomes meaningless through inflation. Do the same with Social Security. Do this. That's all they've been doing. And they trained the government to be the government that does nothing. It's the old laissez-faire. Don't intervene. Don't. Well, of course, they meant don't do anything leftist. They had a long list of what the government should do for them, most of which is the Cold War and gets justified around that. But that's why the ruling class was able to say, now we want to be neoliberal. We want you to get rid of tariffs and because we're the number one country, we can do the best. But it comes out of the class struggle and the very myopic inability that we started today, not able to see, is because your ability to reason has been overwhelmed by the ideological crusade that has governed American culture since 1945.